I would like to emphasise that I strongly believe in freedom of speech. I don't have a problem somebody purporting a theory, writing fiction, suggestions.
So, how did Madeleine McCann die? There are many theories, but let me set out, as I see it, the three main alternatives. Alternative 1. Madeleine died as a result of an overdose or sedatives or other drugs, either cumulatively, over time, or administered on that holiday. Alternative 2. Madeleine died in a freak accident, either when the McCanns were present or when they were not present. If the death was an accident, there needs to be a reason for the cover-up. If the McCanns were not present, the accident could have been covered up to conceal the McCanns' negligence. Or an autopsy might reveal previous ill treatment of Madeleine, for example, the use of sedative drugs or physical or sexual abuse. Or because there was a mystery about her true parents, i.e. she was not the true daughter of both parents, or she was a surrogate or was adopted. Alternative 3 is that Madeleine was the subject of an unprovoked assault by either parent or possibly someone else that killed her. Whatever the cause of death, were the McCanns and their group of friends connected in some way with a high-level paedophile ring, and perhaps that is why her death was covered up? Were the McCanns able to call in favours? This, by the way, was the exact phrase used by Kate McCann's uncle, Brian Kennedy, who lived in the same village as the McCanns. According to a report in the Daily Mail, Brian Kennedy spoke of how the family were calling in some favours. Or was there some other secret which bound the McCanns and the Tapper Seven together? That will lead me on to discuss whether on that holiday Madeleine could have been passed to a paedophile to abuse her and died during that encounter. I'm going to start by looking at the hypothesis that Madeleine died by some sort of drugs overdose, maybe sedatives. There are a number of indications that this, at the very least, may be a factor. I've made heavy use of analysis of the subject by a former police superintendent known on the internet as Peter Mack. If you look at the accounts Kate McCann has given of her immediate reactions to Madeleine being missing, she speaks of having yelled, hitting out at things, banging my fists on the railings, running from pillar to post, throwing open, hurtling out, started screaming, was hysterical, and so on. It is surprising then, if the twins really were there during these events, that they did not wake up. I wandered into the children's bedroom several times to check Sean and Emily. They were both lying there on their fronts in a kind of crouch, with their heads turned sideways and their knees tucked under their tummies. In spite of the noise and lights and general pandemonium, they hadn't stirred. They had always been sound sleepers, but this seemed unnatural. Scared for them too, I placed the palms of my hand on their backs to check for chest movement, basically for some sign of life. Had Madeleine been given some kind of sedative to keep her quiet? Had the twins too? Fiona Payne, in her statement, claimed that Kate had put a finger under the children's noses to test for breathing. But what is absent is any sense of urgency, of rousing them to make sure they were alive and breathing. Is the account of the twins doubled up in a crouching position fabricated? Perhaps created to suggest that the abductor could have sedated them? It is stated that at some point friends carried the still sleeping twins to another apartment. There is no proof at all that the twins were even in the McCann's apartment that evening. The Portuguese police report of the 10th of September 2007 was clear in saying that the crime scene in the children's bedroom had been arranged. The police who spoke to Kate McCann on the 3rd of August said, "She now presumes that they were under the effect of some sedative drug that a presumed abductor had administered to the 3 children in order to be able to abduct Madeleine," a situation which Kate refers to being possible. In a TV programme in 2009, Gonçalo Amaral was asked, "Do you think the children were sedated?" He answered, "There is no doubt. Kate called a colleague of mine on or about the 10th of August to ask the PJ to check the twins for traces of sedation. Kate was apparently alone when she called, and a bit upset. But that same afternoon, Jerry called and cancelled the request." Up until that date, more than 3 months after Madeleine was reported missing, the McCanns had not previously asked the police to carry out toxicology tests on the children. Then Kate asks, but Jerry later the same day cancelled her request. Several weeks later, though, the McCanns organised their own drug tests on the children, which took place on the 24th of September 2007. That was very nearly 5 months after Madeleine's reported disappearance. It allowed enough time for most drug toxins to have long since been eliminated from their bodies. Moreover, it was someone from the government-backed, highly questionable Control Risks Group who arranged to carry out the tests. The McCanns didn't initially volunteer the scientific results, but in the end, an Indian newspaper, Dajé, established that a company called Tricotest had performed the analysis. Kate McCann stated in her book, all the hair samples produced negative results. While this didn't totally exclude the possibility that the children had been sedated, especially given the time that had elapsed, it meant nobody else, including the PJ and the media, could prove otherwise. Nobody else could prove otherwise. The result eventually announced on the 20th of October that no scientific evidence of sedative drugs or other drugs was found was welcomed a few days later by Jerry McCann, who, once again, emphatically denied they had ever used sedatives. He told The Sun, "It's ludicrous. These sorts of questions are nonsense, and we shouldn't be giving them the light of day. There is absolutely no suggestion that Madeleine or the children were drugged. It's outrageous." But strangely, despite that finding, the McCanns and those around them kept on promoting the idea that all 3 children might have been sedated by the abductor. For example, on the 2nd of October, Susan Healy, Kate's mother, claimed that Madeleine had been drugged by her abductor. Jerry McCann claimed on the 19th of November the twins were still sleeping in their cots, so we tried to leave it as undisturbed as possible, and they slept very soundly until we moved them out of their cots into another apartment. Which does make you wonder if there was any substances used to keep them asleep. Diane Webster, the mother of one of the Tapper 7, told Leicestershire Police in 2008, the twins were still asleep in the cot, and with all the noise going on, I don't know how they slept through it, which makes me think they must have been drugged with something by the abductor. I think Madeleine would have been drugged as well. Later, on the 10th of April 2008, Fiona Payne said, "But the twins were okay. I mean, they were fine. They were asleep, but at the time it did seem weird. They didn't wake up, and again, that was quite strange. Even in the transfer and being handled by people that weren't their parents, they didn't wake up." Later still, October 2009, 2 former detectives employed by the McCanns, Dave Edgar and Arthur Cowley, told a newspaper that they were convinced the abductor went to the family's apartment on May the 3rd, 2007, fully prepared with sufficient drugs, probably chloroform, to knock out all 3 children. The fact that Sean and Amelie, just over 2 years old, failed to wake when the alarm was raised, nor even as they were taken to another apartment in the cold night air, has persuaded the detectives that they too must have been drugged. And in a serialisation by the Sun newspaper of Kate's book, we read that Kate McCann said the kidnapper who seized Madeleine may also have drugged her other 2 children, as she launched a new appeal in the hunt for her missing girl today. She said she had to check that the twins, Sean and Amelie, were still breathing because they did not wake as they began a frantic search for the missing 3-year-old. We must ask, why the McCanns kept on repeating the "they were sedated" mantra, and bear in mind that I believe the McCanns know there was no abduction. Both Kate McCann and her doctor friend Fiona Payne were both qualified anaesthetists. If so, surely they would be able to distinguish the difference between a child which was merely asleep and one that had been heavily sedated. Could the McCanns themselves have been sedating the children? Kate's father, Brian Healy, in a TV interview conceded that, "I think they may have used Calpol, like most mothers."
In that evening, did you give to your kids something like Calpol to help them sleep?
We're not going to comment on anything, but, there is absolutely no way we used any sedative drugs or anything like that. And, we have cooperated fully with the police. We'll answer any queries, any tests that they want to do.
On the date he was made a formal suspect, Jerry McCann stated, "When we travelled to Portugal, we brought several medicines, namely Calpol, Nurofen for fevers and pains, both for adults and children, Losec for gastric problems he occasionally suffers from, and an antihistamine called terfenadine for hay fever. I didn't give any of these medicines or any others to the children while on holiday in Portugal." The terfenadine was left unsecured in a low-level piece of furniture in the parents' bedroom. It had the US brand name Seldane on the packet. It is a risky drug capable of producing dangerous heart issues such as heart arrhythmia, and can be lethal if combined with grapefruit juice. It has been withdrawn from several countries. Some speculated that these had been given to Madeleine, or that she had got hold of some of these tablets herself, mistaking them for sweets. How should we interpret all this? We have a family member telling an interviewer that the McCanns may have used Calpol, yet Jerry McCann unconvincingly denies this. Then we have efforts to accuse an abductor of sedating all three children. A syringe lying close to some tranquilizers and surgical gloves was found in the villa where the McCanns stayed after leaving apartment 5A. A Portuguese police report reads, "Were the children sedated?" Kate McCann, via the Portuguese police inspector who acted as liaison officer for the family, asked on the 10th of August why samples weren't taken from the twins in order to test the hypothesis that they had been sedated. She knew well enough at that time, more than 3 months later, that such an examination would be worthless. However, she went further and said that we, the investigation, should verify that the abductor had sedated Madeleine in order to accomplish his action, and that he had also sedated the twins as to be able to abduct them as well. But she didn't bring up these things at the appropriate time. What we know for certain is that the sedatives have periods in which to act as a sedative, and timings at which they are normally completely expelled from the body that vary between 6 and 200 hours. The McCann's medical knowledge is enough to know this. I suggest that the McCanns did at least use Calpol and possibly other sedatives. Madeleine, we are told in many reports, was a very lively child. Therefore, is it possible that Madeleine was given an excessive dose of something, say on the Sunday night, and died later? A number of other possibilities have been suggested to account for the McCanns' persistent angst about sedatives in this case. One is the suggestion that the McCanns and their doctor friends on that holiday might have been carrying out covert medical research on some new sedative drug, or that the McCanns had some connection with one or more major pharmaceutical company. Another suggestion is that Madeleine might have died from a Ritalin overdose. Jerry McCann's elder brother, John McCann, worked for major pharmaceutical firm AstraZeneca. In the days after Madeleine was reported missing, acting as a family spokesman, he announced that AstraZeneca had given him indefinite leave from his job. This seemed rather drastic, but at that time there was still presumably hope that Madeleine could be found alive any day. The Times on the 22nd of May 2007 reported, "Gordon Brown has pledged his support. Last Friday, John McCann was dining with his friends when Downing Street called to say that the Chancellor was on the line. Minutes later, Mr. McCann's mobile, on which he takes hundreds of calls daily, ran out of power, cutting off Britain's next Prime Minister in mid-sentence. Yesterday morning, as Mr McCann was talking to the Times, his mobile rang again. It was Revenue and Customs calling at Mr Brown's request to discuss how the fund could gain charitable status. The campaign has two nerve centres, one in Pride of Luz. The other is the Glasgow sitting room of John McCann, 48, who is on indefinite leave from his job as a medical rep for the pharmaceutical company AstraZeneca. There he fields endless emails and telephone calls. Various medicines were found in the villa the McCanns were staying in from July to September 2007. The issue of drugs and sedatives continued to be raised and caused an angry reaction from Kate McCann in 2012, 5 years later. The Daily Express reported Kate McCann's angry attack on alleged lies in a Spanish TV documentary on the case over drugs that were found in their holiday apartment and later in the villa they moved to in July 2007. The drugs found in the villa, she said, were simply drugs for Parkinson's disease, which her father Brian Healy suffered from. As for Ritalin, one viewer who has seen my films asked if Madeleine could have died from a Ritalin overdose. Ritalin is frequently prescribed by doctors for the condition known as ADD or ADHD for hyperactive children. This viewer gave me some alarming statistics on how many children are routinely prescribed this drug and about the vast profits made by its manufacturers. I've looked up some references to Ritalin, and there have certainly been a worrying number of child deaths caused by Ritalin, numbered in the hundreds if not thousands, and there is allegedly evidence that coroners have colluded in minimising the number of child deaths attributed to Ritalin. But the problem is we do not have a body. The toxicology checks on the twins didn't take place for nearly 5 months and so were worthless. Whether sedation played at least a part in Madeleine's death can't be established, but can by no means be ruled out. I now come to the freak accident theory, which was the one advanced by Gonçalo Amaral and the PJ Inspector Tavares de Almeida, who wrote a report on the case on the 10th of September 2007, 3 days after the McCanns were declared suspects. He concluded, the minor, Madeleine McCann, died in apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia de Luz on the night of the 3rd of May 2007. At this moment, there seems to be no strong indication that the child's death was other than the result of a tragic accident. Now, there is evidence that Madeleine's death could be associated with loss of blood. We know that the smell of corpse odour was found in 12 places associated with the McCanns, in the apartment, in the car, on Kate's clothes, etc. Blood or body fluids were found in 5 of those locations. I appreciate that the second round of forensic tests conducted by the Forensic Science Service were inconclusive, allegedly because of contamination, and that the blood and body fluids only might be Madeleine's. We know the first set of results seemed to be a clear indication that the body fluids were from Madeleine, albeit from low copy DNA, but that result was superseded by the Forensic Science Service report. I want to focus on the very strong alert that the dogs gave to the area below the window in the McCann's apartment lounge. The cadaver dog Eddie gave a major immediate alert here. The blood dog found blood or body fluids in the exact same spot. In fact, there was a sufficient quantity of body fluids for one of the tiles in the corner to be lifted, where more body fluids were found. There is every possibility that during a period between Madeleine's death occurring and an abduction being announced, the apartment had been thoroughly cleaned. So if there was an accident, this looks like the spot where it might have happened. For that reason, a common suggestion is that Madeleine might have fallen off the sofa and banged her head so hard that she died from her injuries. It was a hard tiled surface. However, I consider the possibility of a fatal accident occurring from such an accidental fall to be unlikely. Let us assume first that it happened whilst the McCanns were in the apartment. Accidents do happen and may sometimes be fatal. If it was such an unfortunate accident, why would they not inform the hospital straight away, even if she had died? It is a crime to conceal a body. An explanation that she had been playing around and banged her head on the floor would probably be accepted, unless, that is, her injuries were not consistent just with an accident. However, the position would be rather different if, say, Madeleine and the twins had been left on their own in the evening. The accident happened soon after they left, and they had not got back until the early hours of the morning. If this was the case, rigor mortis might have set in, and therefore the hospital and the police might ask them searching questions about why it took them so long to find that Madeleine was dead. In that scenario, the presumption of a significant degree of negligence would arise, with prosecution being a real risk. So that might have made the McCanns decide to attempt to cover up. There is a third possibility, namely that there was indeed an accident, but that if Madeleine's body was presented for an autopsy, the authorities would discover something that the McCanns would desperately want hidden. The following suggestions have been made. There might be pre-existing signs of physical abuse. There might be pre-existing signs of sexual abuse. A toxicology report might reveal signs of past sedatives or other drugs in her system, or her medical records or an analysis of her DNA might reveal something that the McCanns wanted hidden. The following suggestions within this have been put forward: that she was adopted, or a surrogate child, or was not the child of both parents, or even that she was the product of some genetic engineering project, perhaps a clone. On the subject of possible physical or sexual abuse, we have a range of photographs and videos of Madeleine which the McCanns have put into the public domain. Generally, they show a happy, active, talkative child. Crucially, we also have 3 photographs of Madeleine which, as I showed in my last Madeleine film, were most possibly taken on the first day of the McCanns' holiday, Saturday the 28th of April. These show a happy, lively young girl enjoying her holiday. Whilst signs of abuse are not always easy to spot, there is no real evidence of Madeleine looking unhappy, poorly fed, or unwell in any way. There is, however, one exception to that, and that's this photo, the so-called make-up photo, which seems to have been taken near the end of her life, which I will come back to later. The third possible cause of death I suggested was the possibility of an unprovoked violent assault. A sudden loss of temper, perhaps by either of the parents or possibly by a third party. One reason for suggesting this is that such an event would create a much more powerful incentive for the McCanns to cover up Madeleine's death. Her injuries might prove that violence or excessive force was used, more than would result from an accident. The body fluids, including blood, found under the living room tiles is another potential indicator that a violent death may have occurred, possibly Madeleine being thrown against the wall or the floor, for example. In the bottom right of this picture, you can see where the removed floor tiles were. Also in this picture, you can see several spots, numbered up to 13 on the walls. Altogether, the Portuguese police located 16 spots in the living room where they were able to obtain a sample of DNA from body fluids. 10 of these, numbers 4 to 13, were on the walls, 3 on the floor, 2 on the back of the sofa, and 1 elsewhere. Some have referred to the 15 spots on the wall, floor, and back of the sofa as showing spatters of Madeleine's blood. We cannot say that on the basis of the Portuguese analysis. One spot was matched with the DNA of a previous occupant, Sally Gordon. The Portuguese compared the swabs with 280 local residents whose DNA might conceivably have been deposited in the apartment, but there were no other matches. There was not enough DNA on most of the swabs to attempt to try and match the DNA with Madeleine's. In any event, the spatters are so widespread that they would have resulted from a very violent blow, which would surely have left a lot more blood everywhere. So, despite claims by some that these might be blood spatters from Madeleine, the evidence is simply not there. But that by no means excludes the possibility of a violent event having happened. Something we should look at, therefore, is whether there is any propensity for violence in either parent. Starting with Kate McCann, Here are some quotes from her own book on the night when she claims Madeleine was abducted. "I was overwhelmed by fear, helplessness and frustration. I was hitting out at things, banging my fists on the metal railing of the veranda. The frustration and anger were reaching boiling point. I felt like a caged, demented animal. Finally, I erupted. I began to scream, swear and lash out. I kicked an extra bed that had been brought into the apartment and smashed the end right off it." And here are 3 other quotes from later on in the holiday. "My frustration with their lack of progress whipped up a storm of fury in me that was completely out of character. It seems to me now as if for several months I was possessed by some demonic alien that infiltrated my thoughts and filled me with anger and hatred. I needed a face on which to pin all this rage. My incredulity turned to rage. How dare they suggest I lie? My anger and ferocious maternal instinct began to permeate Jerry's despair. Keeping a lid on my anger, within seconds I was a raging lioness. I was incensed. My anger was bubbling below the surface. I felt such disdain, I found myself whispering, 'Fucking tosser, fucking tosser.'" Later, Kate was to write of the Portuguese police detective Gonçalo Amaral, "He deserves to be miserable and feel fear. I wanted to inflict the maximum pain possible on him for heaping all this on us." Yet strangely, of the person who abducted her child, she was able to say, "I can probably forgive Maddie's abductor. I don't want to be eaten up by hatred." We know newspaper headlines cannot usually be believed, especially in this case, but I've noted how many of them over the years have mentioned the McCann's fury, anger and rage. So it seems there is evidence that both Kate and possibly Jerry McCann might be capable of being temperamental, furious and angry. Another concern about Kate McCann was revealed early on when one of the McCann's relatives volunteered the surprising information, which I have not yet verified, that there was always someone with Kate when Jerry was frequently away from home on holidays or on business. I believe it was a suggestion that she was possibly at risk to herself and others if on her own with the children, but as I said, I have not got this confirmed. The Portuguese police asked several questions concerning how Kate dealt with the children. What was Madeleine's behaviour? Did Maddie suffer any disease, or did she take any kind of medication? What was the relationship like between Madeleine and her siblings, her friends and her colleagues at school? In England, did you give your children medication? What type of medication? Do your twin children have difficulty in falling asleep? Are they unruly, and does this upset you? Is it true that at certain times you were desperate over your children's behaviour and that caused you to be upset? Is it true that in England you considered the possibility of handing over Madeleine's guardianship to a relative? Kate refused to answer all of these questions, as she did with 40 other questions she was asked, exercising her legal right to silence. However Madeleine died or was killed, it seems probable that her injuries or condition were serious enough to be covered up. The presence of a quantity of body fluids under the living room tiles that had to be removed would suggest that at least the possibility that a violent act may have been responsible for Madeleine's death. That seems more likely to me than an accidental fall from a settee. Let us suppose for a moment that Madeleine died either from an accident or from a violent act, and that in either case the McCanns decided to cover it up. Most people would then ask, as many have done, why on earth would the Tapas 7 help them cover it up? True, they were all quite close friends, especially the McCanns and the Paynes. True, they were all doctors, apart from 2 of the wives. But would that be enough for them to tell lies and all agree to go along with an elaborate abduction hoax? A charade intended to deceive the police? I believe the evidence suggests that they did help the McCanns to cover up Madeleine's death, as I showed in my first Madeleine film. So there must surely be more to it. And that brings me to the 4th option I want to consider, namely, were the McCanns connected in any way with a paedophile ring, or, even worse, was Madeleine passed to a paedophile to be abused and died during an encounter with him?